When you look back into the world of 1914, you feel like you're looking into a sort of period drama. I mean, everybody's in these exotic costumes. It's a world full of what seem to us to be oddities, exotic queer personalities, as if somehow this is a world, a bygone world, a world we have lost, and these are people who have bygone ideas, right? If their helmets had garish green ostrich feathers on them, then maybe their dreams and thoughts also had garish green ostrich feathers. That's the assumption that steadily asserts itself. But don't be fooled, because these people were very like us. They were just as smart as us, and in many cases, almost every case, well-intentioned. They were trying to do the best they could, and yet they produced this appalling outcome. Just remember that this was a geopolitical system very like our own, facing dangers and risks very like the ones that we face in today's world. And that's where the kind of cautionary lessons of 1914 lie.
Before 1914, Europe had begun to divide itself up into two armed camps. On the one hand, you had Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, and on the other hand, you had Britain, France, and Russia. What that meant is they were tending to work with each other so that every time there was a crisis, and there were increasing crises after 1900, the temptation was for alliance partners to back each other. So there was always the danger of more than one country being pulled into a conflict.
The existence of competitive and potentially mutually hostile great powers wasn't in itself enough to bring this war about. What actually triggered the war was Europe's most unstable region by the early 20th century, the Balkans. And the real problem was that the interests, the geopolitics of the great powers got tied up with the unstable politics of the Balkan Peninsula. That was how this war broke out.
The Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his morganatic wife Sophie were murdered in Sarajevo by a nitwit 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, who was an ardent Serbian nationalist and certainly was funded by a Serbian terrorist organization called the Black Hand.
Against that background, Pius X was very ill and was dying. And he had allegedly warned about the outbreak of a great war, un guerrone, for a long time previously. But it has to be said that at this point the Vatican diplomacy was effectively impotent. The Vatican had virtually no input into the diplomatic crisis.
Austria-Hungary decided that this was a time to deal with Serbia, which they felt was behind the assassination. Serbia to them was a menace on their southern borders. And so Austria-Hungary decided, even knowing that Russia might come in to defend Serbia, that they would deal with Serbia. They then went to Germany and got what came to be called the blank check. Germany said, okay, do what you want, even at the risk of Russia coming in to protect Serbia.
Russia, alarmed by events in Austria, started mobilization. Germany, alarmed by Russian mobilization, started a counter-mobilization. France, in turn, mobilized its forces. Austria attacked Serbia, declared war on Serbia, made an entire mess of its initial campaign. Germany decided to adopt another lunatic German military policy and invaded France by hooking through Belgium and the Low Countries, thereby violating Belgian neutrality.
The final step is when Britain decides on the 3rd of August that it will come into a war against Germany unless Germany backs down. And so by the 4th of August, Germany has not backed down. Britain then declares war on Germany. So in 5 weeks, Europe goes from peace to war.
These are impressive and smart people, and they're doing what they think is rational in terms of the interest of the nation state that they represent. And yet the interaction of their specific rationalities was irrational. The system as a whole behaved irrationally.
Pius X died, and perhaps to many people's surprise, at the beginning of September, Giacomo della Chiesa, Archbishop of Bologna, was elected as his successor. He had only been a cardinal for a few months, literally 2 or 3 months before he was elected. But I think it's very clear that the cardinal electors in the conclave knew what they were doing. They were electing someone who was a diplomat and a pastor. The choice of Benedict, I think, was a very carefully calculated one to try and give to the church in this very difficult situation when Catholics were fighting on both sides, to give the church some stronger position in the conflict.
When the war broke out, in most countries, churches tended to support it. And the churches played a considerable role in recruiting for the military and trying to keep the country together, the nation together for the war effort. It was only as the war dragged on that you began to get doubts surfacing.
When it became apparent what the scale of catastrophe really was, there were voices in many different places saying it should be ended right away. The Pope was one such voice, but there was a profound pacifist movement at the same time, of which Bertrand Russell was an eminent member.
Benedetto XV condannò questa guerra, definì la Prima Guerra Mondiale come il suicidio dell'Europa. La sua posizione era diversa da quella dei movimenti pacifisti dell'epoca. I movimenti pacifisti condannavano la guerra in ogni sua forma come principio. Benedetto XV ribadiva la concezione tradizionale cattolica per la quale esistono guerre giuste e guerre ingiuste. La sua non era la condanna di ogni guerra, ma di questa guerra in particolare.
Before 1914, there was very little by way of appreciation of what a European war would mean. The movement to end the war, the pacifist tradition, the religious tradition, had no leverage. It wasn't listened to.
It's very hard to weigh up how much real diplomatic influence the Vatican had, the Pope had. In the end, he was defeated by the forces of realpolitik, he was defeated by the forces of total war.
An estimate which most historians accept is that some 9 million men died in war itself. Probably twice as many, say 18 million, perhaps more, were wounded in the war, often very badly, and bore the scars for the rest of their lives.
The psychological effect of the men who fought the war was significant. How could it be otherwise? But what they took away was a sense of brooding nihilism. Nothing is effective.
I think what the war did was shake the faith that many Europeans had in their own elites. Political elites, business elites, military elites, and of course religious elites. I mean, I think a lot of Europeans concluded that they'd been led into a ghastly conflict, really a catastrophe for Europe, because the consequences didn't end when the war ended. I mean, a lot of political upheavals and social upheavals were taking place. And I think that affected religion as much as anything else. And church attendance began to go down, and it's of course been declining ever since in certain countries. I think there was just a sense that they no longer believed in anything much. And I think you get, certainly in the 1920s, a lot of public comment about how the young are only living for pleasure and to enjoy themselves. And you can understand it. I mean, I think there's a sense that they're living in a shattered world. If you notice what happens at the end of the First World War, a number of the old monarchies are swept away. I mean, Austria-Hungary not only disintegrates, but it no longer is a monarchy. None of its different pieces really remain as monarchies. In Germany, the Kaiser is overthrown and Germany becomes a republic. Russia, of course, has a revolution and gets rid of the Tsarist regime. And so I think there is a general feeling that the old established order just didn't work, got us into this mess, and we need something new. Now, what that also did, of course, is provide fodder or fuel for what were going to be extremist political movements, both on the right and on the left. I mean, a number of people who joined the fascist movement early on were former soldiers who were disillusioned with their own elites, and you got very much the same thing in the sorts of people who joined communist parties.
Look at what happens to Russia. Russia is the world heartland of orthodoxy. The Russian Empire is replaced as a result of the cataclysmic sort of pressures of this war by an atheist regime, and a regime which officially denies the existence of a god of any kind, the Bolshevik regime of Vladimir Lenin. In the case of Germany, Germany doesn't become an atheist country. It remains a Christian country, but it loses the Christian system is decapitated because the Protestant churches of the German regions were headed by their respective monarchs. The Kaiser was also the Summus Episcopus, the first bishop of the Prussian Church of the Prussian Union. So his disappearance into exile in 1918, in a sense, cuts the head off the Protestant system of the Prussian state.
Pope Benedict XV and his Secretary of State, Cardinal Gasparri, obviously were glad to see the end of the war, but they were very, very pessimistic about the peace. One particular area of concern to them was the way in which Germany was treated. They felt that Germany had been treated too harshly, over reparations. They'd fought very hard to prevent the Kaiser being put on trial, for example, and they were very unhappy about the overall peace settlement in Europe. And they warned that there would be another war unless some of the issues were not further resolved.
The First World War releases all the demons of that human beings are capable of living under the aegis of, racism, ultra nationalism, the hatred between nations, intolerance, and so on, political ultra violence, ideological extremism. All that is greatly augmented by the First World War. The Second World War then shows us the consequences of this, the Gulag, the concentration camps, Auschwitz.
La Prima Guerra Mondiale produsse un forte cambiamento nella cultura e nella mentalità. Basti pensare al mito della gioventù, della giovinezza che si affermò dopo la Prima Guerra Mondiale, un mito della giovinezza che era legato al crollo di quelli che erano i valori tradizionali. Si affermò in Europa la American Way of Life, cioè una concezione di vita pragmatica ed edonista, molto diversa da quelle che erano le abitudini tradizionali degli europei.
The one thing we can take away from the 20th century is the unquestioned, the undoubted fact that it destroyed Western civilization. It destroyed a great, ancient, 2,500-year-old civilization. There is just nothing left of it. And the debris is widespread. It's not simply the political institutions are profoundly suspect. Nobody really believes in any of the political institutions on view either in Europe or in the United States. But you can go along every dimension: musical, artistic, the graphic arts, philosophy, literature. All of these suffer wounding blows as the result of the 20th century.
Ovunque la via per risolvere le problematiche aperte deve essere quella diplomatica del dialogo. È la strada maestra già indicata, con lucida chiarezza dal Papa Benedetto XV, allorché invitata i responsabili delle nazioni europee a far prevalere la forza morale del diritto su quella materiale delle armi, per porre fine a quella inutile strage che è stata la prima guerra mondiale.
One of the oddest things about 1914 is that although, of course, inevitably it's always slipping further and further back into the past, and it's now 100 years ago, that the amount of time between now and then is steadily increasing, nevertheless, it's nearer to us today than it was in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. Because in the era of the Cold War, the world's affairs were dominated by the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's no longer the case. We're now back to a multipolar world, a bit like the world of 1914. The United States is tiring of some aspects of its role as world policeman. China is emerging as a new great power with claims of its own. Russia is in an uncertain position. It's fighting a kind of rearguard action. And the EU is a very sort of wobbly, rather unfocused peace order, which finds it very difficult to make up its mind or to project power externally or even internally. So in terms of how the global system works, we're entering a period of great uncertainty.
So I think the underlying theme of early 20th century history carries over to early 21st century history. The magnitude inherent on small steps, perfectly ordinary quotidian steps, which might lead to a miscalculation, is of an enormity that cannot be grasped and certainly could not be controlled.
Here we are 100 years later, and we still have a potentially very dangerous situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. You know, the Croats are still very suspicious of the Serbs. Look at nationalism in the Ukraine, you know, competing nationalisms. We haven't got very far since 1914.
This is not a safe world, and I think the message of 1914 is be very vigilant, don't be complacent, don't assume that we'll see a war coming, a major conflict coming from years in advance and be able to prepare for it. We should be anything other than complacent.